chapter 1, a series I've entitled Understanding Life. And now we come to the last of the 7 days of creation. The first 6 days involved separation, light from darkness, day from night, water from dry land, the woman from the man. It was bringing order out of what in Genesis 1 verse 2 called formless and void. Day 7 is the last act of creation, separated from what is ordinary from what is holy, thereby laying the foundation for Israel's worship. It also looks ahead to that coming day of rest, as we read about in Hebrews chapter 4, chapter 12, and chapter 13. So let's read today's passage, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which we had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which we had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. There's 3 verbs in these 3 verses. In verse 1, the verb is completed. In verse 2, the word is rested. In verse 3, the verb is blessed. Each of the 3 verbs is linked to God. Each of the 3 verbs is linked to the seventh day. God completed his work on the seventh day. God rested on the seventh day. God blessed the seventh day. We're going to look at each of these verbs as we move throughout the passage. So verse 1, so the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. One thing about Bible passages is that the writers love to put in verses that I call bookends. They put boundaries on a portion, like a story, verses that indicate the beginning and the ending of the passage. Very handy in oral cultures as memory devices for telling stories. The audience heard, they recognized, okay, I've heard this before. This is the end of that portion. In this case, we have to go back to Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 2:1 as the bookends for this story. The 6 days of creation setting apart from the seventh day. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In chapter 2, verse 1 says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. Genesis 1:1 starts the creation story, being told. 2:1, it ends it. They're the bookends. Genesis 1:1 tells us what God is going to do, and Genesis 2:1 tells us what he did. In between are the details. As we move on in a coming week, Genesis 2:4 and following will give selected other details, telling the story of creation again from a different perspective, a second telling of the story. It's what we've referred to here previously as a stacked motif, a doubling up. It's like Jesus saying, verily, verily, or truly, truly. He was emphasizing what he was about to say. Or the angels in Isaiah crying out, holy, holy, holy. Not only was it a double, it was a triple. That stacked effort of drawing attention to something that's very, very important. Or in the Gospels, why do we have 4 Gospels? They're telling the story of Jesus 4 times from some different perspectives, told in different ways, to tell us that, yeah, this story is important. Let's listen to it again. Or like the parallel lines we have in the book of Psalms. Each verse is either 2 or 3 lines long, all in a similar meaning. But the verse 1 here in chapter 2 says, the heavens and the earth were completed. This tells us that God had completed his work. No loose ends to tie up, no problems to fix, no modifications were required. No tinkering with creation until he gets it right. Nothing evolving into something else. The universe did not remain a work in progress. Everything was completed, finished. God knew what he was doing. His creation was perfect. In fact, he himself said it was very good. In science, we're going to switch tacks here instead of Bible. Let's talk about science. Science loves to say, they look at Genesis early chapters and they say, oh, it's just myth, it's hogwash, no such thing ever happened. But let me tell you about science. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only be converted into something else. Systems that use energy do not use it up, they only convert it into a different type of energy, maybe heat, motion, sound, light, chemical or electromagnetic energy. These are all different things that we can convert from one to another. Einstein's famous theory equals mc squared tells us that matter is simply another form of energy. Put a log in a fire, the log is consumed. We thought it goes away, but it's turned into heat and light. The universe is created by God is a closed system. It includes all the matter, all the energy that exists. There's nowhere else for it to go. In science, that was the first law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics focuses on the first law, or follows on the first law. The energy being converted from one type of energy to another always moves in a negative direction. In life, the negative change is always towards disorder. In other words, things run down. If you looked at your body lately, they wear out. But that's like all of nature. Systems left to run on their own always evolve from order to chaos, never the other way around. Nature left to itself will always decline towards disorder, not evolve into something better. Nature left to itself will sink to the lowest common denominator. A rotten apple in a basket of good apples, that rotten apple will cause the others to become rotten. It never works the other way around. The good apples do not make the rotten apple become good. This is the way of nature. Everything decays. Everything dissipates, disintegrates. Think of this. If the universe were infinitely old, it would be wound down already. The universe is not eternal nor self-sufficient. In other words, creation is not an ongoing process of getting better and improving. That's not the way nature works. Genesis chapter 1 tells us that God created the universe. Genesis 2 verse 1 tells us that God completed that work. In fact, Genesis 2 verses 1 to 3, we're told 4 times that God has completed his work. And in the same 3 verses, we're also told 4 times in completing his work included all of his work. Once completed, there was no ongoing creation of matter or energy. God was done. Creation was done. So I ask the question, if God finished his work, what was his work? Well, Genesis 1:1, the opening bookend, tells us, in the beginning, God created. Then he brought order into that creation. The 6 days of creation were an act of creative power. After the 6 days, he just did not create any more of creation. This does not talk about his ongoing work in sustaining the creation or his providence and then his work of redemption. While the high point of his creative act was the creation of man and woman, we discussed that last week and the week before and the week before. We had 3 weeks on that one topic. But the high point of creation was man and woman. The climax of the week was day 7, when God rested. While the laws of thermodynamics are all about conservation of energy and disintegration or deterioration, God's work of creation was about innovation. He was creating. It was about integration, making it work together. The exact opposite of what science tells us today. Science only deals with present processes, things it can observe and test. By observation, science should never have concluded that with their own laws of thermodynamics in place, those laws being about conservation, it could never have produced a universe, almost requiring infinite processes of innovation and integration. The theory of evolution is simply used to eliminate God. They're trying to tell us that there is no God, and even if there was, he couldn't do miracles like creation. The very laws of science rendered the theory of evolution as impossible. They don't see it. So how do we know anything about how the universe was produced? Well, God told us. We have it in his word. God created. He started it. He completed it. It is finished. Reminds us that God completes his work. The Bible tells us that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it. So we have a God that we read about here. He completes his work. It's good for me, good for you. With God completing all that he has done, reminds us that God is the creator. He created all there is. There is a confession that this whole creation thing is a confession that he had done it. Reminds us that God is the creator. He created all there is. He is Lord of Lords. He's Lord over all. He created it. He completed it. It's his work. Remembering the Sabbath expresses man's commitment to the service of this Lord. Verse 2, on the seventh day God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. I would like to point out the doubling up, this stacking again of telling us that God completed his work. It was in verse 1, now here it is again in verse 2. Another example of stacking items in a story in order to emphasize their importance. So it's important to know God completed his work. In Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, the seventh day is mentioned 3 times. This doesn't happen on any other day. The mention of 3 times is about stacked reference to something that's very important. This day is unlike any other day. First of all, let's be clear about what this is not saying. With God resting, it's not saying that he had abandoned the universe. In the New Testament, Jesus affirms to us that God is still at work in the world, even on the Sabbath. We read about that in John chapter 5, verse 16 and 17. With God resting, it's not saying that he was tired. Unlike the laws of thermodynamics, God cannot dissipate his energy. He is complete, cannot be fatigued, does not run down, does not need regeneration. He is fully self-contained. He is God. Resting literally means cease, and implies only that his creative work was complete. Psalm 121 verse 4 says he neither slumbers nor sleeps. Isaiah 40 verse 28 and 29 says, did you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not get weary or tired. That's what it's not saying, that God is tired and he needs a rest or he abandoned his universe. With that clarity on what God's resting did not say, the next question on the opposite side says, what does it say? Sabbath in Hebrew is Shabbat, and it simply means to cease. Resting implies only that God's creative work was complete. He stopped creating the universe. So first of all, when God rested or ceased his creative work, he was endorsing all of creation. There was nothing more to do in creating or bringing it to order. Think of a master artist when finishing a painting or sculpture, steps back to enjoy his work. God took delight in his work when he pronounced it very good. God modeled a pattern for man's work cycle. He modeled the need for rest. There's a story, a joke actually, I think, it's not in the Bible. It's about a preacher who did not take any days off. He just worked every day of the week. And when asked about it, he said that, well, Satan doesn't take any days off, so I can't either. The person asking him then says, Pastor, I think you have the wrong role model. Is your role model God or Satan? Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11 in the Ten Commandments, it tells us that the seventh day is to be set aside for a day of worship in the Mosaic Law. The 10th Commandment law also tells us that the Sabbath was a principle from the very beginning, the seventh day of creation. This day of rest was sacred, set apart, holy, because God rested in it. The 10 Commandments says so. The Sabbath rest, whether it was every seventh day or every seventh year or every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, or the promised land that the Israelites were going to when they left Egypt, that was called the land of rest. It was promised to the Israelites in that way. Or the eternal rest that awaits all believers, according to several chapters in Hebrews. All this is rooted in creation and God wanting us to rest from our normal work and spend some time with him. Having said that, Colossians 2:16 makes it clear the Mosaic Sabbath has no symbolic or ritual place in the New Covenant. We are not required as believers in the New Testament era to keep the Sabbath. As believers, we worship on the first day of the week to remember and celebrate the resurrection of Christ. Sunday worship looks forward to the Sabbath rest that Jesus Christ purchased for us on the cross. This is what Hebrews talks about. Since sin entered the world to even now, a Sabbath rest points to Christ's redemptive rest, looking forward to the end times when we will rest in him. It's a return to Eden, if you will. And this was achieved by Christ with his resurrection and his ascension when, according to Hebrews 10, verse 12 and 13, he sat down at the right hand of God and waited. So picture this. On the cross, Jesus says, it is finished. When he then died, rose from the grave, and a few weeks later, he ascended into heaven and sat down. That's the same picture I get with God resting on the Sabbath. And I'll come back to that. So what was the Sabbath from creation all about? If the Ten Commandments said that Sabbath is important because God rested, but then the New Testament says it's not important to believers, each day is up to each individual's conscience. What was Sabbath from creation all about? Well, notice in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, the seventh day, the day of rest, nowhere in those verses is Adam mentioned. There's no law or requirement of rest and worship. God rested, but a Sabbath day of rest for man was not mentioned. There was no restrictions governing what Adam could or could not do on the seventh day of the week. All that came later, given to Israel in the Ten Commandments. The ceremonial requirements for the Sabbath were for the nation of Israel. The word Sabbath does not even appear in scriptures until Exodus chapter 16. From Moses on, the Israelites were commanded to remain in their dwellings on the Sabbath. They were not allowed to buy or sell. They were not to light fires or cook on the Sabbath. They were not to gather sticks for a fire. In fact, in Numbers chapter 15, verse 32 to 36, there's a man who was stoned for doing that very thing. He was gathering sticks on the Sabbath in order to light a fire and cook his meal. He was stoned to death. That's how serious they took it. The Sabbath laws were designed to show the Israelites what paradise was. Adam and Eve living in the garden, not a worry. They didn't have to stoke the fires. They just eat fruit off the tree. It was a life. It was paradise, we call it. But in Exodus 31, it says, "The children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever." It's not a sign to anyone else, just to Israel. So picture this. Adam and Eve in Eden, before they sinned, was precisely what the Sabbath laws picture. Remember when they sinned in chapter 3? Then they heard the footsteps of God in the garden. They recognized the sound. They were used to communing with God, spending time with Him. This is the picture of rest. And since the Sabbath laws were ceremonial to Israel, they were not abolished. Israel still has that. But they were fulfilled under the new covenant. For Christians, that law has been fulfilled. It's been finished. It's still there for the Israel people, but not for us. Christ has restored in a more perfect way the spiritual Sabbath rest of Eden, according to Hebrews 4:10. Notice what is omitted on this account of the seventh day. Unlike the other 6 days, this one did not end with the phrase, "and there was evening and there was morning the seventh day." It's not there. The seventh day was still a 24-hour day, like the other 6 days. After the seventh day, there was another day of 24 hours and another, and we're still getting them. But what it is saying, even by what it's not saying, is that God entered into a covenant, into a permanent rest from His creative works. If it had not been interrupted by Adam's sin, that rest could have continued indefinitely. Everything was perfect. No labor, no decay, no sickness or pain or death. Adam lived in an ongoing Sabbath rest, interrupted only when he sinned. And because of that sin, God interrupted his rest to work on redemption. See, God wanted to redeem us from our sin, to make us whole. Jesus says to Nicodemus in John 3:3, "You must be born again." God wanted to redeem us so we could again enter that rest. But He was unable to because of sin, so that's why He had to send His Son Jesus to die on the cross. So we've talked about what this rest isn't and what it is. We've talked about why. We've talked about its importance. I want to talk now about the how. When it says that God rested, have you ever thought about how this happened? What did it look like? Did He recline on a couch somewhere? Did He go to the beach? Watch a movie? Well, of course not. None of these. They're just silly. It doesn't tell us here in Genesis 2, but we can get glimpses from elsewhere. When Jesus finished His work on the cross, Jesus the man, Christ the Messiah, when He finished his work. He died on the cross to pay for our sins. He resurrected from the dead to give us new life. He ascended into heaven and he sat down. And there he intercedes for us. He prays for us. When Satan says, "Ha! You see that pastor over there? You know what he did?" Jesus says, "It's paid for. Slate is clean." For believers who are born again, saved, redeemed, adopted into God's family. Not just for everybody. Not everybody's going to heaven. Only the redeemed. When Jesus, God the Son, completed his work, he rested by sitting on a throne in heaven. And I like to suggest that when God the Father completed his work of creation, he sat down on the throne of the universe in the same way as Jesus would do later. And from there, God rules the universe that he just created. He watches over us. He provides for us. He rules from his throne. He is Jehovah Roy, my shepherd. He is Jehovah Jireh, my provider. He is Jehovah Shalom, my peace. He's Jehovah Rafika, my healer. Jehovah Sidkenu, my righteousness. He's Jehovah Shammah. He's just here. He's everywhere. He is Jehovah Nisi, my victory. He is Jehovah Mekadeshem, my sanctifier. He rested from creation, but he's doing all this. 3 more thoughts on the Sabbath. As one of the 10 commandments, the Sabbath is a sign that the Creator had set Israel apart in a covenant relationship. That's the 10 commandments. It's one of the distinctive marks of Judaism. Sabbath observance for the Jews is a reminder to them that they were once slaves in Egypt, and the Lord has redeemed them from servitude unto rest. Today, that significance has been fulfilled in Christ. He has redeemed us. The Sabbath is meant for people, not people for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a time to heal and do good. But as I mentioned earlier, Colossians 2:16 says, the Sabbath observance is not binding on church or church people. It's a matter of conscience. So we come to verse 3. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. What's it mean by God blessed the seventh day? Well, think of blessed as a gift. We often hear prayers, Lord, bless me, or bless so-and-so. It's like a gift. God, I want you to give something good to these people. This blessed gift is full of promise as God's people are summoned to share it, testifying that there is a rest in simply being with God. The way is being prepared for the final saving rest. But note, this is the only time during the creation process when God blessed a unit of time. He blessed the day. He sanctified it. He declared it holy. The term holy is applied in the Bible to something that is set apart, not ordinary. This is the first use of that word. Think of sanctified as claimed. God claimed the day as his own. In simple terms, setting a day aside as special is not unlike having company. You got company coming over, you get out the good dishes. You want to do something special. Well, it's much more than that. That's just an earthly example. The seventh day is set apart as a special occasion, a day unlike the regular workday, elevated above the other days. It's holy. It's a permanent reminder of the glory of creation and the surpassing glory of the Creator. The seventh day is a memorial to a completed creation. To reject a 6-day creation, as some people do, is to unbless the seventh day. It robs God of the glory due his name. Christians worship God the Father and the work of his Son, Jesus Christ, on Sunday the day of his resurrection. He rose from the dead so we could have new life, so that we can look forward to the rest of the new covenant when we get to glory. This does not negate that Saturday should be identified in our minds with the completion of creation. In our society, many people work Monday to Friday, get the weekend off, except if you're a pastor, then you got to work on Sunday. The priests in the Old Testament, they had to work on the Sabbath, doing sacrifices, things like that. There are exceptions, but that's another story, not for here. Taking a weekend off is not just a break from work. While we're not bound by the ceremonial requirements of the Mosaic Law, nobody from Adam to Moses was given any ceremonial restrictions forbidding activity on a Saturday. But the text says that God hallowed the day. He set it apart for a memorial with no instructions as to how. Just like Sunday is a witness to the finished work of redemption and the resurrection, Saturday is a witness that God finished the work of creation, and God said it was very good. God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. So, next Saturday, instead of simply enjoying a day off from work, try to spend some time enjoying God's creation. Relax. Go camping, go skiing, go boating, spend time in the garden playing in the dirt, go for a drive in the mountains. God said his creation is very good. He wants us to enjoy it. Here are a couple more reasons to celebrate Sabbath. In Hebrews 4, verse 1 to 11, the Sabbath rest gives assurance to saints that just as God entered his rest after working 6 days, so we as believers live in the hope that when we cease from our labors, after our fleeting days are over, we too shall enter an eternal rest. In the New Testament, by faith, we have already entered that rest. The goal of spiritual living is not to amass a wealth of information or goods, but to face sacred moments that will mold us and shape us into the image and likeness of Jesus, sanctifying us just as God did to the seventh day. Going back to the absence of, and there was evening and there was morning, it's not there. This is believed by many to mean that God's Sabbath rest is something which carries on into the present from that very first week of creation. At least it has a future implication. The Mosaic law about Sabbath is fulfilled and is no longer a requirement for us. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He said that in Mark 2, verse 27. So we look forward to our eternal rest. While the scribes and Pharisees surrounded Sabbath keeping with rules about not working, things like no long walks, no ordinary work, no cooking or preparing for cooking, or anything that even looked like work. Well, the rules of the Pharisees were fences put around the Sabbath to protect people from accidentally breaking the Sabbath. So they built fences, and then fences around the fences. And as such, they made the Sabbath onerous, burdensome. It wasn't about God anymore. It was about the people, what they did or didn't do. On another occasion, Matthew 23:23, Jesus commented that the rules of the Pharisees drove them to care only about keeping the minutiae of the law. And in doing so, they missed the whole point of what God wanted from them and for them. And Jesus quoted Micah 6:8. What God wants from us is to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. And throughout all of history, God's rest has been an invitation to his people to share his fellowship. Not just for an hour on Sunday morning, not just for the seventh-day Sabbath, not just in eternity, but now, today, every day, in the way we act, the way we love, in our daily walk with God, to pray without ceasing, to give thanks always, to love him and serve him, to love and serve others, to see Jesus in the faces of those in need. Remember that story in Matthew 25 of the separating the sheep from the goats at the judgment day? And Jesus tells him, because you did it to these, the least of my people, you did it to me. Because you didn't do it to the least of these, my people who are in need, you didn't do it for me. And so I pray that we would see Jesus in the face of others who are in need. And doing these things, I think, is part of rest. It's part of enjoying and caring for his creation. Because of disobedience, the Israelites in the wilderness did not enjoy God's rest. In their case, the promised land. They wandered the wilderness for 40 years. And they never entered the promised land, that generation. The next generation, their kids did. However, the invitation to enjoy God's rest still remains. This is why the writer of Hebrews encourages his readers not to fall, not to fail, to receive God's rest because of disobedience. Instead, Hebrews 4:16 says we are to draw near to the throne of God's mercy with confidence, to find grace to help us in our time of need. Taking a day off regularly to rest in him will not result in our poverty. It's saying that we trust him, that he will provide for us, that we rest in him, we hope in him, we are sustained by him, not by our own labors. So I conclude with this statement. Through the mercy and grace of God, which comes to us in Jesus Christ, may we enjoy fellowship with God and enter his rest.